Kicked out at 18, I inherited a dusty feed store. What I found inside wasn't just about the past. It was about my entire future. And if you've ever felt like your life was a story written by someone else, I hope you'll stick around for this. Maybe even hit that subscribe button, because what I learned in that forgotten place is something we all need to hear. Your story matters, and sometimes you have to fight for the right to tell it yourself. The day I turned 18 was the day I ceased to exist, at least on paper. For 10 years I had been a ward of the state, a file in a cabinet, a line item in a budget. My existence was measured in biannual reviews and caseworker visits. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, the final form was signed. The file was closed. I was handed a cardboard box containing 2 changes of clothes, a well-worn paperback, a toothbrush, and a thin manila envelope. The box felt light, but the envelope felt impossibly heavy. Ms. Anya, my caseworker for the last 3 years, stood by the door of the group home, her expression a careful mixture of professional sympathy and undisguised relief. Her job was done. "Leo, this is it," she said, her voice attempting a warmth it couldn't quite achieve. It was the same tone she used when telling me my therapy sessions were being reduced. Institutional kindness. It had the texture of sandpaper. I nodded, not trusting my own voice. The air in the hallway was thick with the familiar smell of industrial cleaner and overcooked broccoli. For a decade, that smell had been the scent of my life. Now, I was supposed to walk away from it and feel, what? Free? The door to the director's office was open down the hall, and I could hear the drone of a daytime talk show. In a few minutes, my bed would be stripped, my nameplate removed from the door. Another boy, younger and more lost than I was, would take my place. The system was a river. It didn't care about the individual drops of water, only that the current kept flowing. "The envelope," Ms. Anya prompted, gesturing with her chin. "It's from the state solicitor's office. It arrived last week. We were instructed to give it to you on your Emancipation Day." Emancipation Day. It sounded so grand, so historic. It felt like being pushed off a cliff. I looked down at the envelope. My name was typed on the front. Leo Vance. No "in care of," no state ID number, just my name. It was the first piece of mail I had ever received that treated me like a real person. I held it, my thumb tracing the sharp edge. "What is it?" I asked. My voice was a croak. "We don't know the specifics," she said, shifting her weight. She was already thinking about her next appointment, her next crisis. "It's a legal matter, something to do with your grandfather, an inheritance." The word hung in the sterile air between us, alien and absurd. Inheritance. That was a word for people in movies, for families who had things to give. My family was a collection of ghosts. My parents, a car crash on a wet road when I was 7. My grandfather, Gus, was even more spectral. He was a warm, rough hand holding mine at a county fair, the smell of sawdust and stale popcorn. Then, nothing. The story I was told was simple and brutal. He left, packed a bag, and walked away from his son, his daughter-in-law, and his 6-year-old grandson. He abandoned us. It was the first and deepest cut of my life. And now, 12 years after he vanished, and 10 years after I'd lost everyone else, he was a name on an official document. He had something to leave me? It felt like a joke, a cruel, cosmic punchline. "There's a number inside for a lawyer," Ms. Anya added, her duty discharged. "She's expecting your call. And Leo, good luck." She gave my shoulder a quick, awkward squeeze. Then she opened the front door. The March air was cold and bit at my cheeks. It smelled of exhaust fumes and damp pavement. It smelled like the rest of my life was about to begin. I stepped across the threshold, from the world I knew to a world that had no place for me. The heavy door clicked shut behind me. The sound was final. I was alone. I stood on the sidewalk, the cardboard box under one arm, the envelope in my hand, and for the first time in a very long time, I had no idea what was going to happen next. The bus station was a cathedral of transient souls. People were either running from something or running toward it, and the air was thick with the scent of diesel, desperation, and cheap coffee. I found a hard plastic chair in a corner, placed my box on the floor between my feet, and stared at the envelope. For a solid 10 minutes, I just looked at it, turning it over and over. It was a portal to a past I'd been taught to forget, from a man who was the source of my oldest wound. My hands were shaking slightly. It was the cold, I told myself, but it wasn't. It was fear. The fear of what was inside, and the fear of what wasn't. Finally, I tore it open. Inside were two things: a single, heavy, old-fashioned iron key, and a letter printed on thick, creamy paper. The letterhead read, "Albright and Finch, Attorneys at Law." I scanned the formal, legal language. The sole heir to the estate of the late Gustav Vance. Property located at 121 Mill Road, Oakhaven. Consists of a commercial building and lot, formerly operating as Gus's Feeds. Significant property tax arrears. The words swam in front of my eyes. He was dead. The late Gustav Vance. I hadn't even known. No one had ever told me. He hadn't just been absent all these years, he'd been gone. A fresh wave of something cold and hollow washed over me. It wasn't grief, not yet. It was the shock of discovering a ghost was, in fact, a ghost. The letter went on, mentioning the tax debt, a number with too many zeros, and then something else. A standing offer from a company called Apex Development. They wanted to buy the property. The letter concluded by giving me the name and number of a Ms. Eleanor Albright, the lawyer assigned to the estate. I leaned my head back against the grimy wall. A feed store in a town called Oakhaven I'd never heard of. It made no sense. Gus was a mechanic, or so I remembered, a man with grease under his fingernails and a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. What was he doing with a feed store? And why leave it to me, the grandson he'd thrown away? Using the last of the credit on my prepaid phone, I dialed the number. A crisp, professional voice answered on the second ring. "Eleanor Albright?" Hello. This is Leo Vance," I said, my voice feeling small in the cavernous station. "I was told to call you." There was a pause, the sound of a pen tapping on a desk. "Mr. Vance, yes, I've been expecting you. I'm sorry for the nature of our introduction, and for your loss, however distant." Her voice was calm, pragmatic, emotionally detached, the kind of voice that deals in facts, not feelings. I didn't know he was gone," I admitted, the words tasting like ash. "When?" "Almost 2 years ago," she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly. "It took some time to locate you within the state system. The bureaucracy can be challenging." "So what is this?" I asked. looking at the iron key in my palm. This property. As the letter states, your grandfather left you his place of business. Unfortunately, he also left a considerable debt to the county. The back taxes amount to just over $12,000. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. $12,000. I had $43 in my pocket and a government-issued debit card with a balance of $250. That was my fresh start package. So it's worthless, I said. Not entirely, she corrected. As I mentioned, there's an offer from Apex Development. They've been trying to acquire properties along that old commercial strip for a new retail project. Their current offer is $25,000. After the taxes and my legal fees are settled, you would walk away with approximately $10,000. $10,000. To me, it might as well have been $1 million. It was a ticket out, a way to get an apartment, to start a life. It was the sensible thing. They advise you're making a decision soon, she continued. The offer is contingent on a quick sale. Frankly, Mr. Vance, it's your best and only option. It's a clean break. You sign the papers, the money is wired to your account, and you never have to think about Oak Haven or that building again. A clean break. The words echoed Ms. Anya's sentiment. Everyone wanted me to have a clean break from a past I didn't even understand. But looking at the key in my hand, a stubborn, unfamiliar feeling began to sprout in the barren landscape of my heart. It was a stupid feeling, illogical, but I couldn't shake it. I want to see it first, I said. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her calculating, recalibrating. Mr. Vance, she said slowly, that's not a practical course of action. It's a derelict building in a town with nothing to offer you. It's a 3-hour bus ride to nowhere. Take the money. It's the smart move. I want to see it, I repeated, my voice firmer this time. I didn't know why, but I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I had to. I had to stand in the place he'd left me. I had to know what I was giving away. Before I could sign away the last piece of my grandfather, I had to understand what it was. Her sigh was audible over the phone. Very well. The key you have fits the front door. The bus leaves from the central depot twice a day. Let me know what you decide. The line went dead. I sat there as the bus station announcer called departures to cities I would never see. I had a destination now, a place called Oak Haven, a town at the end of the line. The decision to go wasn't a decision at all. It was an impulse, a magnetic pull. What was the alternative? Find a homeless shelter in the city? Burn through my $250 in a week on cheap motel rooms? Ms. Albright was right. From a practical standpoint, it was a stupid move. But my life had been dictated by practicality for a decade. Every meal, every scheduled activity, every mandated therapy session was designed for maximum efficiency and minimum emotional investment. For once, I wanted to do something that didn't make sense on a form. I wanted to do something because I felt it. So I bought a one-way ticket to Oak Haven. The bus was old, the seats covered in a faded, scratchy fabric that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and regret. I took a window seat and watched the city blur and dissolve behind me. The towering glass and steel buildings gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to strip malls, and finally to open country. The landscape flattened out. The sky grew bigger. We passed skeletal trees just beginning to bud, their branches reaching like desperate fingers toward a pale, washed-out sun. We passed fallow fields, the dark earth turned over and waiting. For 2 hours, I didn't think. I just watched the world slide by. It was a hypnotic, numbing procession of gray asphalt, brown fields, and green and white highway signs. The other passengers were a quiet lot. An elderly woman knitting, her needles clicking a soft, steady rhythm. A young soldier in fatigues, asleep with his head against the vibrating window. A mother with a fussy baby, murmuring soft, soothing words. We were all in our own bubbles of transit, suspended between where we were and where we were going. My own bubble was filled with a swirling vortex of confusion and a dull, familiar ache. The ache of abandonment. I had buried Gus deep. He was the first ghost in a life that would become crowded with them. To survive, I'd had to believe the story they told me, that he was a bad man, a man who didn't love me enough to stay. It was a simpler, cleaner narrative than the messy reality of love and loss. Believing he was selfish made my own pain feel justified. But his death and this strange inheritance complicated that story. A man who abandons his family doesn't leave them property, even debt-ridden property. A man who doesn't care doesn't arrange for a lawyer to track you down 10 years later. It was a puzzle, and the last piece was waiting for me in a place called Oakhaven. As the third hour of the journey began, the landscape changed again. The flat fields gave way to rolling hills. The towns we passed through got smaller, the gaps between them longer. The bus began to slow, making stops in towns that were little more than a gas station and a post office. Finally, the driver called out, "Oakhaven, next and final stop." My stomach tightened. I was the only one left on the bus. The driver looked at me in the rearview mirror. "You sure this is where you want to be, son? Not much here for a young fella." "It's where I need to be," I said, more to myself than to him. The bus pulled to a stop in front of a small, clapboard building with a sign that said, Oakhaven Town Hall. There was no station, no depot, just a bench and a single, flickering street lamp. I grabbed my box and stepped off the bus. The doors hissed shut behind me, and with a groan of hydraulics, the bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking into the twilight until they were gone. The silence that descended was absolute. It was a living thing, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the lonely hum of the street lamp. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth, wet leaves, and something like wood smoke. It was clean and sharp, and it felt like I was breathing for the first time all day. I stood there for a moment, an island in the quiet dark. The main street was a single lane in each direction. Storefronts were dark, their windows like vacant eyes. A single traffic light at the far end of the street blinked yellow, over and over, marking a crossroads to nowhere. This was it, the place he ended up, the place he wanted me to find. Following the address from the lawyer's letter, 121 Mill Road, I started walking. My footsteps echoed in the empty street. It felt like walking through a museum exhibit of a town. A hardware store with a dusty window display. A diner with its chairs stacked upside down on the tables. A barber shop with a faded red and white pole. And then I saw it. At the very edge of the commercial block, where the street began to fray into country road, stood a long, low-slung building. It was bigger than the others, with a high, false front that gave it a sense of faded grandeur. Two large plate-glass windows, opaque with grime, flanked a recessed central door. Above the door, clinging to the weathered wood, were the faint outlines of letters. Some were missing, but I could still make them out. G-U-S apostrophe S. F-E-E-D-S. My heart did a slow, painful lurch. This was it. I walked up the 2 shallow concrete steps and stood before the door. The paint was peeling, the wood beneath splintered and gray. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a lifetime. I reached into my pocket, and my fingers closed around the cold, heavy iron of the key. It felt ancient, like an artifact from a different time. For a moment, I hesitated. This was the point of no return. As long as the door was closed, I could still turn back. I could catch the morning bus, call the lawyer, take the money. I could choose the clean break. But I knew I wouldn't. I had come too far. I slid the key into the lock. It resisted, gritty with rust and disuse. I had to jiggle it, push it, my knuckles scraping against the cold metal plate. Finally, with a painful grating sound, it slid home. I took a deep breath and turned. The lock resisted for a moment, then with a loud, resonant clunk that echoed in the silent street, the mechanism gave way. The door was unlocked. The smell hit me first. It was a complex, layered scent, thick as a shroud. The primary note was dust, a dry, ancient dust that coated the back of my throat. Beneath that was the faint, mealy scent of old grain and burlap, a hint of cedar from the building's bones, and the sharp, sour tang of mouse droppings. It was the smell of decay, of time and neglect. The smell of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. I pushed the door inward. It groaned on its hinges, a low, mournful sound that seemed to disturb the very air inside. A wave of colder, staler air washed over me. The interior was a wall of absolute darkness. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy in the cold, and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut a narrow, trembling cone through the blackness. Dust motes, thick as a blizzard, swirled in the light, each one a tiny, forgotten world. I took a hesitant step inside, the door swinging slowly shut behind me, plunging me back into darkness for a second before my light found its footing again. The floorboards creaked under my weight. I was standing in a large, cavernous room. The ceiling was high, lost in the shadows above my light's reach. On either side, massive wooden shelves rose up into the gloom, lined with sagging sacks. Some had burst, spilling their contents onto the floor in pale, ghostly piles. Old seed? Grain? Animal feed? I had no idea. A long wooden counter ran along the back wall, its surface lost under a blanket of dust. On it sat an old-fashioned cash register, its metal tarnished, its keys silent. I ran my light over it, and the beam caught on something. A calendar, tacked to the wall behind the counter. It was a promotional calendar from a tractor company, featuring a smiling woman in a straw hat. The month was June. The year was 10 years ago. A decade. He died 2 years ago. So this place had been sitting empty, exactly like this, for 8 years before he even passed. Why? Why let it all just rot? I moved deeper into the store, my footsteps muffled by the dust on the floor. My light played over the objects, each one a mystery. Strange cast-iron contraptions that looked like instruments of torture. Seed separators, maybe, or grain grinders. Stacks of terracotta pots, some cracked. A rack of rusted shovels and rakes, standing at attention like skeletal soldiers. The place felt like a tomb, not just for a business, but for a life. It felt like the physical manifestation of my own childhood, a space filled with the ghosts of what should have been, left to gather dust. This wasn't an inheritance. It was an accusation. It was a monument to failure, to abandonment. Anger, hot and sharp, flared in my chest. This is what he left me? A pile of debt and dust? A testament to how little he thought of me, to leave me a mess to clean up. My light caught a door in the back corner, behind the counter. It was smaller than the front door, made of simple, unpainted planks. A hand-scrawled sign was tacked to it. Office. I pushed it open. The room inside was tiny, no bigger than a closet. It contained a single metal desk, a swivel chair with cracked vinyl upholstery, and a tall gray filing cabinet. Like everything else, it was all coated in a thick, uniform layer of gray dust. This was the heart of the operation, the nerve center. If there were any answers to be found, they would be here. I went to the desk first. The drawers were stiff, but I yanked them open one by one. They were filled with junk, dried-up pens, rusted paper clips, old invoices for things like 50 pounds cracked corn and alfalfa hay. I slammed the last drawer shut, sending a cloud of dust into the air that made me cough. Frustration was building into a tight knot in my stomach. This was a waste of time, a fool's errand. Ms. Albright was right. I should have taken the money. I turned to the filing cabinet. It was a big, 4-drawer model, probably from the 1970s. I grabbed the handle of the top drawer and pulled. Locked. Of course. I tried the others. All locked. A surge of desperate, childish rage went through me. I wasn't going to be beaten by a stupid piece of furniture. I looked around the main storeroom until my light landed on a heavy-looking crowbar leaning against a stack of feed bags. It was rust-covered, but solid. I brought it back to the office and wedged the tip into the gap above the top drawer. I put my shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. The metal shrieked in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, violent pop, the lock mechanism broke. The drawer slid open with a screech. I shone my light inside, my heart hammering, and found more of the same. Files filled with more invoices, purchase orders, tax documents from 15 years ago. I tore through them, my initial excitement curdling back into disappointment. I pried open the second drawer, the third, the fourth. Nothing. It was just the mundane paperwork of a dead business. It was over. There was nothing here. Defeated, I slumped against the wall beside the desk. The cheap wood paneling creaked under my weight. I slid down to the floor, my head in my hands, the beam of my phone's flashlight pointing aimlessly at the opposite wall. The silence of the store pressed in on me. I was a fool, a sentimental idiot who'd chased a ghost to a graveyard. I pushed myself back against the wall, ready to get up, to leave, to walk out of this place and never look back. And as I did, my shoulder blade pressed against a specific spot on the wall. The panel gave slightly and made a small, hollow sound. I froze. Slowly, I turned and pressed the spot again. It was definitely loose. My heart started beating again, a fast, frantic rhythm. Using my fingertips, I felt around the edges of the panel. It was about a foot square, and it wasn't nailed down like the others. I worked my fingers into a small gap at the bottom and pulled. The panel came away in my hands, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity in the wall. And inside that cavity, tucked away in the darkness, was a small metal box. It looked like an old cash box, painted black, with a simple latch on the front. It wasn't locked. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely work the latch. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, was a stack of letters, maybe a dozen of them, tied together with a piece of old butcher's twine. On top of the stack was a single, newer-looking envelope, folded in half. In a shaky, spidery script that I vaguely recognized from a birthday card I'd received when I was 5, it said one word: Leo. My breath caught in my throat. I sank back onto the dusty floor, the metal box in my lap. The air in the tiny office suddenly felt thin, electric. I gently lifted the single envelope from the top of the pile. The paper was clean, crisp, not yellowed and aged like the others. This one was written more recently. I unfolded it. The same shaky handwriting filled the page. My dear Leo, if you are reading this, then it means 2 things. First, it means I am gone, and for that I am sorry. I hope it was peaceful. Second, it means you came here. You didn't just take the money, you came. And for that, I am prouder than you can ever know. It means there is more of me in you than I had any right to hope for. I know you have questions. I know the story you were told about me, that I left, that I abandoned you and your father and your mother. In a way, it's true. I did leave. But I need you to know why. I need you to know the truth, because the truth is the only real thing a man can leave behind. It was about your father, my son. He was a good man, Leo, but he was weak. He got involved with some bad people, a business deal that was never on the level. They were promising big returns, quick money. Your father, he just wanted to provide. He wanted to give you and your mother the world, but he was in over his head. When the deal went south, it wasn't just about losing money anymore. It was about prison. The men he was involved with, they weren't the kind of people who took losses well. They made it clear. Someone had to take the fall, or things would get much, much worse for all of us. For your mother, for you. I looked at your father, my son, and I saw a man terrified. I looked at you, my grandson, sleeping in your little bed, and I knew what I had to do. A family needs a father. I had already lived my life, a good one, mostly. His was just beginning. So I took the blame. I signed the papers. I took the public shame. I let everyone in this town, everyone we knew, believe that I was the reckless one, the criminal. It cost me my reputation, my friends. It cost me my son. He could never look me in the eye again, you see. The guilt was too much for him. And it cost me you. That was the hardest part, Leo. Leaving you. I told myself it was for the best, that you'd be better off not having a disgraced old man for a grandfather. I thought your parents would raise you, and you'd be safe, and you'd have a good life. I never, ever imagined I would lose them too. When I heard about the accident, Leo, there are no words for that kind of grief. And then, to find out you were in the system, it broke what was left of my heart. I tried to get you, but by then, I was a ghost. No steady income, a criminal record, no legal standing. They wouldn't let me near you. The system decided I was unfit. So I was forced to watch my only grandson grow up from a distance, through whispers and third-hand information. It was my own private hell. But I never gave up on you. I couldn't give you a home, so I decided I would give you a chance. This place, this dusty old store, this was my one remaining asset. I worked, Leo. I took any job I could get for cash. Farm work, fixing engines, hauling junk. I lived on nothing. And every spare dollar I saved, I hid it away for you. I'm leaving you with a choice. There's a company that wants this land. They've been sniffing around for years. The lawyer, Ms. Albright, she'll tell you to sell. She's a good woman, but practical. She'll tell you to take the money and run. And you can. $10,000 is more than I ever had to start with. You can take it and build a life somewhere new and never think of this place again. There is no shame in that choice. It's the easy path, the safe path. But there is another path. This town, Oak Haven, it's dying. But it's full of good people who are just trying to hold on. This store, it could be something again. A place for the community. A place for you. It could be a home if you're willing to fight for it. The money I saved, it's here. It's enough to pay the taxes, to make a start. You just have to find it. Think like a shopkeeper, Leo. Where does everything begin? Where is the first seed sown? This is a terrible burden to place on you, I know. You're just a boy, and I'm asking you to carry the weight of an old man's life. But I'm also giving you a gift. It's the only thing I have left to give. It's the truth, and it's a choice. Your life is your own now, Leo. You get to decide what it means. Whatever you choose, know that I loved you, every single day. I loved you enough to leave you, and I loved you enough to lead you back here. Be brave, my boy. Be good. Your grandfather, Gus. I read the letter once, then twice, then a third time, the words blurring through the tears that were now streaming down my face. I wasn't just crying, I was sobbing. Great, heaving, guttural sobs that tore up from a place so deep inside me I didn't know it existed. It was 10 years of grief, of anger, of confusion, all coming out at once in a dark, dusty office in the middle of nowhere. I cried for the little boy who thought his grandfather didn't love him. I cried for the parents I barely remembered, caught in a tragedy not of their own making. And I cried for him, for Gus, for the lonely, broken-hearted old man who gave up everything, his name, his son, his grandson, to protect them. He hadn't abandoned me. He had sacrificed himself for me. The story of my life, the one foundational truth I had built my entire identity on, was a lie. And the real story was 1,000 times more painful and 1,000,000 times more beautiful than I could have ever imagined. The weight of the box in my lap felt immense. He had left me more than a building. He had left me his legacy, a story of quiet heroism and profound, secret love. And he had left me with a choice that would define the rest of my life. The silence after my sobbing fit was profound. It was as if the building itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. I sat there on the floor, the letter clutched in my hand, my whole body feeling hollowed out, scoured clean. The dust motes still danced in the beam of my phone's light, but they didn't look like forgotten particles anymore. They looked like tiny constellations, a universe of possibilities. The ground hadn't just shifted beneath me. It had been completely ripped away, replaced by something new and terrifying and sacred. If you've ever had the story of your life completely rewritten in an instant, you know the feeling. It's like the world goes silent, and all you can hear is the rushing in your own ears. It's vertigo. It's the terrifying, breathtaking realization that nothing is what you thought it was. If this is hitting you, if you've ever had a moment that changed everything, let me know in the comments. I think we build our lives on the stories we tell ourselves, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let them fall apart to make room for the truth. This community is for people who get that. People who have seen the truth and are still standing. Back in that office, I was barely standing. I was on the floor, my jeans soaked with God knows what, my face sticky with tears. But I was seeing clearly for the first time. The choice Gus had laid out was stark. The sensible path, the one Ms. Albright and the entire world would advise me to take, was the path of the clean break. Take the $10,000. Run. Start over. It was an escape. It was safety. And every part of me that had been trained by the system, the part that craved security, that was terrified of risk, that believed I deserved nothing more than scraps, screamed at me to take it. $10,000 was freedom. It was a future. But it felt cheap. Selling this place, this monument to his sacrifice, for a quick payout to a faceless development company, felt like the ultimate betrayal. It was like taking his life's work, his quiet martyrdom, and selling it for scrap metal. It was spitting on his grave. Then there was the other path, the insane path. Stay, fight, try to build something from these ruins. I was an 18-year-old kid with no money, no skills, and no connections, pitting myself against a development company, trying to revive a dead business in a dying town. It was ludicrous. It was a fantasy. It was a straight path to failure and bankruptcy. It was everything I was supposed to be afraid of. But it was also the only path that honored him. It was the only path that felt true. It was the path of staying, of putting down roots, of accepting the inheritance not as a burden or a windfall, but as a responsibility, as a gift. I looked around the dusty, dilapidated store. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a story. It was a promise. It was the last tangible piece of a man who had loved me more than I had ever known. How could I sell that? How could I put a price on that? My anger, which had been a hot, directionless thing, now had a target. It wasn't at Gus anymore. It was at the injustice of it all. At the men who ruined my father. At the system that failed me. At the developers who saw this place not as a legacy, but as a line on a spreadsheet. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but now it was mixed with something else. A hard, stubborn core of defiance. A flicker of my grandfather's own quiet resilience. He had faced down shame and ruin and solitude for years, all fueled by love for a grandson he couldn't see. Could I not find a fraction of that strength in myself? He believed I could. He had gambled his entire life's savings on the hope that I would be the kind of man who would choose the harder right over the easier wrong. The question was he right to bet on me? I picked up his letter again. His words seemed to glow in the dim light. Your life is your own now, Leo. You get to decide what it means. And in that moment, I decided. I would not be the boy who ran. I would be the man who stayed. The first step was to find the money. My mind raced, replaying the line from his letter. Think like a shopkeeper, Leo. Where does everything begin? Where is the first seed sown? My first thought was literal. Seeds. I had seen sacks of them, piles of them. I spent the next hour in a frenzy, tearing open old burlap sacks, sending up choking clouds of dust and ancient grain. I plunged my hands into dusty bins, feeling for a false bottom, a hidden container. Nothing. Just more dust, more rot, the husks of seeds that would never grow. I was going about it wrong. I was thinking like a treasure hunter, not a shopkeeper. I stopped, forcing myself to be calm, to breathe. I stood behind the main counter, where he must have stood 1,000 times. I tried to see the store through his eyes. Where does a customer's journey begin? What is the first thing they see? My eyes scanned the front of the store, the door, the windows, and right by the counter, a piece of furniture I had barely noticed before. It was a large wooden display cabinet. It was made of a dark, heavy wood, and it was filled with dozens of small, identical drawers, each with a little metal label holder. Most of the labels were missing or unreadable, but I could make out a few. Carrot, lettuce, radish. It was a seed cabinet, the place where you would come to buy the very first thing you needed for a garden, where the first seed is sown. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I went to the cabinet and started pulling open the drawers, one by one. Most were empty. Some contained a few dried-up, rattling seeds and a bit of dust. I worked my way methodically along the rows, top left to bottom right. I was on the last row, my hope starting to fade, when I came to a drawer that wouldn't open. It was stuck fast. I jiggled it. Nothing. I tried to pry it with my fingers, but there was no purchase. I ran back to the office and grabbed the crowbar. This time, I was more careful. I didn't want to destroy it. I gently worked the tip of the crowbar into the thin gap above the drawer and applied steady pressure. With a soft crack of old wood, it gave. I pulled the drawer out. It was heavier than the others, and it was deeper. It went back twice as far as the rest. My hands trembling, I lifted it out of the cabinet and set it on the counter. The top layer was just like the others, a shallow compartment with a few forgotten pinto bean seeds. But I could see that the bottom was a separate piece of wood. I worked my fingernail under the edge and lifted. The false bottom came up easily, and there it was. The space beneath was packed tight with bundles of cash, wrapped in rubber bands that had gone brittle with age. They were mostly 20s and 50s, old bills, soft and worn. And tucked in alongside them was a small, leather-bound notebook, the kind you can buy at any stationery store. For a long moment, I just stared. It was real. He had done it. He had actually done it. I pulled the money out, bundle by bundle, and laid it on the counter. I started counting, my voice a shaky whisper in the silent store. It took me almost half an hour. The final tally was just over $50,000. It wasn't a fortune, not in the grand scheme of things. But in my world, it was everything. It was enough to pay the taxes. It was enough to fix the roof. It was enough to turn the lights on. It was enough to start. It was hope in worn, faded stacks of paper. Then I picked up the notebook. Inside, in Gus's same handwriting, were pages of notes. Dates, names, account numbers. It was a detailed record of the shady deal my father had been pulled into. It didn't paint my father as a saint, but it clearly laid out the coercion, the threats. It named the other men involved. It was leverage. It was protection. It was his final gift to me. I stood there, surrounded by the dust and the dark, with a pile of money on the counter and a book full of dangerous truths in my hand. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, hard clarity. I knew what I had to do. I pulled out my phone. The battery was at 5%. I had one call to make. I dialed the number from the letter. It rang twice. Eleanor Albright. Her voice was the same, crisp, professional. But this time, I wasn't a scared kid on the other end of the line. I was someone else. "Ms. Albright," I said, my own voice steady, resonant in the quiet room. "This is Leo Vance. I've made my decision." "Mr. Vance," she said, a note of impatience in her tone, "I do hope you're calling to tell me you're ready to sign the papers." "No," I said. "I'm calling to tell you that I'm not selling. I want you to draw up the paperwork to officially reject the offer from Apex Development. And I'd like to know the best way to wire $12,000 to the county tax office first thing in the morning." There was a long, profound silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her blink. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its professional shield. There was a hint of something new in it, surprise, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of respect. "Mr. Vance," she said slowly, "are you sure you know what you're doing?" I looked around the dark, silent store, at the ghost of my grandfather's life's work. "Yes," I said, "for the first time in my life, I think I am." The 24 hours after that phone call were a blur of terrifying, decisive action. The moment I hung up with Ms. Albright, a switch flipped in my head. The grief and confusion were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but a new, urgent sense of purpose took over. I was no longer a passive victim of my circumstances. I was an active participant. I was the owner of Gus's feeds, and there was work to be done. First, I slept. I found a pile of old, surprisingly clean burlap sacks in a back corner, dragged them into the office, and collapsed. I slept the dreamless, leaden sleep of the utterly exhausted. The dust and the dark my unlikely blankets. I woke to the first rays of morning light filtering through the grime on the front windows, painting stripes of gold across the dusty floor. The air was cold, but the light was a promise. I felt aches in muscles I didn't know I had, but my mind was clear. The plan was simple because it had to be. Step 1, secure the asset. I took $10,000 from the cash box. It felt like a profane amount of money to be carrying, and left the rest hidden back in the seed drawer. I walked the half-mile to the Oak Haven Town Hall, my footsteps feeling lighter, more purposeful than they had the night before. The town looked different in the daylight. It was still quiet, still worn around the edges, but it wasn't a ghost town. An old pickup truck rattled past, the driver giving me a curious nod. I saw a woman sweeping the steps of the diner. The place was breathing, just shallowly. The tax clerk was a woman named Marge, with a formidable perm and glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked me up and down as I approached her counter. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted it. "I'm here to pay the back taxes on the old feed store," I said, pulling the bundles of cash from my jacket pocket. "The property at 121 Mill Road." Marge's eyebrows disappeared into her hairline. She stared at the cash, then back at my face. "You're Gus Vance's boy?" she asked, her voice softer now. "His grandson," I corrected. She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze searching. "I'll be," she murmured. "You've got his eyes." She took the money and began counting it with practiced efficiency. "You know," she said without looking up, "a lot of folks in this town were hard on Gus after. But he was a good man, quiet, kept to himself, paid his bills until he couldn't. It's good to see someone trying to make this right. Good to see this place get a new start." She stamped my receipt with a satisfyingly loud thunk and pushed it across the counter. "Welcome to Oak Haven, son," she said. It was the first time anyone had welcomed me anywhere. I walked out of the town hall feeling 10 feet tall. The property was mine, free and clear. The next step was the work itself. I went to the hardware store I'd passed the night before. It was a wonderland of practical magic, smelling of oil, sawdust, and potential. I bought the basics: heavy-duty trash bags, buckets, sponges, work gloves, a new push broom. The man who ran the store, a lanky fellow named Carl, loaded it into a wheelbarrow for me. "Fixin' up the old feed store?" he asked, leaning on the counter. I nodded. "Gonna try." He grunted. "About time. Place has been an eyesore for a decade. Gus would be glad to see it. He used to buy all his supplies here. Let me know if you need anything. First bucket of paint's on me when you get to that stage." And so began the great cleaning. I threw open the front and back doors, and for the first time in years, a cross breeze stirred the stagnant air. The sunlight, weak as it was, streamed in, illuminating the monumental task ahead. I started by sweeping. I swept for hours, pushing a decade of dust, debris, and mouse droppings out the back door. The dust was so thick, it was like shoveling brown snow. I filled bag after bag with ruined sacks, rotted paper, and unidentifiable junk. It was back-breaking, filthy work. By the end of the day, I was covered head to toe in a thick layer of grime. My hands were raw. My back was a symphony of protest. But the store was transformed. It wasn't clean, not by a long shot, but it was clear. You could see the floor. You could walk from one end to the other without tripping. You could breathe without choking. As I was sweeping the last of the dirt out the front door, a woman walked up. She was the woman I'd seen earlier from the diner. She was holding a small, covered tray. "I'm Betty," she said with a warm smile. "I run the Oak Haven Diner. Marge over at the town hall told me you were staying. Said you were Gus's grandson." I leaned on my broom, too tired to be shy. "Leo," I said. "That's me." "Well, Leo," she said, handing me the tray, "fighting a decade of dust is hungry work. This is my welcome to the neighborhood pot roast. There's more where that came from tomorrow, if you want to stop by for lunch. On the house." I was speechless. The smell of the warm food was intoxicating. Thank you," I managed to say. "Don't mention it," she said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "This town could use a little new life. Gus would be proud." She turned and walked back toward her diner, leaving me standing there with a hot meal and a lump in my throat. Later that evening, Ms. Albright called. A new letter had arrived by courier from Apex Development's lawyers. They had rescinded their original offer and made a new one. $75,000. It was a huge jump. But the tone of the letter was different. It was less of an offer and more of an ultimatum. It was a take it now before we make things difficult for you kind of offer. "They're trying to intimidate you," Ms. Albright said, a new edge in her voice. She sounded less like a dispassionate lawyer and more like a co-conspirator. "They assumed you were a desperate kid they could lowball. Now they see you're serious, so they're trying to scare you off with a bigger number before you realize what the property might actually be worth to them." "What should we do?" I asked. "I took the liberty of looking into your grandfather's notes," she said, referring to the photos of the notebook I had sent her. "The names he mentioned. One of them is a senior partner at Apex. It seems they're not just trying to buy a property, they're trying to bury a history. This gives us leverage. I thought about my grandfather, alone and disgraced, quietly documenting their crimes. He wasn't just saving money, he was building an arsenal. "So, what's the plan?" I asked. "I'm going to draft a response," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "A very polite, very firm rejection of their offer. It will also contain a carefully worded sentence or two that lets them know we are in possession of certain historical documents that might be of interest to regulatory bodies. We'll see how they like that." After I hung up, I sat on the front steps of the store, eating Betty's pot roast straight from the container. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. The street was quiet. The single traffic light blinked its lonely rhythm. But it didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt peaceful. I had a roof over my head. I had a hot meal. I had an ally. And I had a purpose. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I was on the winning side. A month passed. The calendar page in the diner turned from March to April. The skeletal trees on the edge of town began to show a faint green haze. And in that month, my entire world solidified. The fear and uncertainty didn't vanish completely, but they receded, like a tide going out, leaving behind a solid shoreline of purpose. The feed store became my universe. My days fell into a simple, satisfying rhythm. Wake with the sun. Work until my body screamed for rest. Eat, sleep, repeat. The work was my therapy. With every layer of grime I scrubbed from the windows, I felt like I was clearing away a layer of my own past. With every broken floorboard I replaced, I was building a new foundation for myself. I wasn't just cleaning a building, I was reclaiming a life. Ms. Albright's letter to Apex Development had the desired effect. An immediate, deafening silence. The intimidating offers stopped. The pressure vanished. They knew that I knew. For now, it was a stalemate, and that was a victory in itself. It bought me time, and time was the most valuable currency I had. The money from the seed drawer was a lifeline. I used it with the care and reverence of a monk. I paid a local electrician to rewire the whole building, replacing the ancient, frayed wiring that was a fire hazard waiting to happen. I paid a plumber to get the water running again in the small, grimy bathroom. The first time I turned the tap and saw clear, cold water pour out, I felt like a king. The community of Oakhaven, which had at first seemed so spectral and distant, slowly revealed itself to me. It wasn't a sudden welcome. It was a gradual, quiet acceptance, built on small gestures. Carl from the hardware store did give me my first bucket of paint for free, a clean, optimistic white for the interior walls. Betty from the diner insisted I eat lunch there every day, refusing my money until I finally convinced her to let me wash dishes for an hour to pay my way. An old farmer named Silas, who had bought his feed from Gus for 30 years, stopped by one afternoon. He didn't say much. He just walked around the store, nodding his approval at the new wiring and the clean floors. Before he left, he handed me a worn, dog-eared book. Gus wasn't just a shopkeeper, he said, his voice raspy. He knew things about the soil, the seasons, knew what to plant and when, knew how to treat a sick animal. Most of what he knew is in that book. Thought you should have it. It was my grandfather's gardening journal, filled with his spidery handwriting, detailing decades of local knowledge. It was a roadmap. It was another piece of him. I wasn't just inheriting a building, I was inheriting a role in the community. One evening I was sitting on the front steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The store was clean. The lights were on. It was still empty, still just a shell, but it was a shell full of potential. I was thinking about my grandfather. I had spent so much of my life being angry at his ghost. Now, I felt nothing but a profound, aching gratitude. He hadn't left me a burden. He hadn't left me a fortune. He had left me something infinitely more valuable. He had left me a home. Home. The word had always been abstract to me. It was a place other people had. It was a feeling I saw in movies. It was a file folder in a social worker's cabinet. But sitting there, on the cool concrete steps of a dusty old feed store in a forgotten town, I finally understood what it meant. Home wasn't a place you were given. It was a place you chose. It was a place you built. It was a place you were willing to fight for. It wasn't about four walls and a roof. It was about connection. It was about purpose. It was about knowing your place in a story that was bigger than yourself. My inheritance wasn't the $50,000 or the deed to the property. That was just the startup capital. My real inheritance was the choice he gave me. The choice to stop being a victim of my story and to become its author. He had trusted me to be strong enough, brave enough, and stubborn enough to see the value in something the rest of the world had written off. He had trusted me to see the home hidden inside the ruin. And in trying to live up to that trust, I had found myself. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I could make the business work, if I could turn Gus's feeds into Leo's feeds. I didn't know if Apex Development would come back with lawyers and lawsuits. There were 1,000 ways I could still fail. But for the first time in my life, that didn't scare me. Because for the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was building. I was home. So that's where my story really begins. Not on my 18th birthday, when the state let me go, but on the day I chose to stay. The day I chose to pick up a broom and start sweeping. It's funny, isn't it? We spend so much of our lives waiting for a big moment, a grand gesture, a lottery win that will change everything. But most of the time, real change starts with a small, quiet decision. The decision to show up. The decision to try. The decision to clean up a mess instead of walking away from it. Maybe you've inherited something that felt more like a burden than a gift. A complicated family history, a responsibility you didn't ask for, a story you didn't want to be a part of. We all have those inheritances. They can be chains that hold us to the past, or they can be foundations we build our futures on. The choice is always ours. The biggest challenges are often just invitations in disguise. They are invitations to become the person you were meant to be. My grandfather's story was one of hidden sacrifice, of a love so deep it had to be silent. His legacy wasn't written in headlines or carved on a monument. It was written in the dust of a feed store, in the pages of a secret notebook, and in the heart of a grandson he gambled everything on. So many of us have people like that in our lives, whose love we might not understand until much later. Their sacrifices are the invisible architecture that supports us. If this story made you think of someone, a parent, a grandparent, a mentor, I hope you'll take a moment to honor them, even if it's just in the quiet of your own heart. This channel, this community we're building, is for stories like this. It's for the fighters, the builders, the ones who find hope in hopeless places. It's for the people who know that home is a verb, not a noun. If that's a conversation you want to be a part of, I'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. It's more than just a click. It's a way of saying that these stories matter, that our stories matter. And in the comments below, I really want to know, what's the one thing you would fight to protect? It could be a place, a person, a memory, a principle. What is the thing that makes you say, "Here I stand, I can do no other"? I'm going to read every single one of your answers, because I believe our stories are how we find each other. They are the light we use to navigate the dark. Thank you for listening to mine. The work here is just getting started, but for the first time, I'm not afraid of what comes next. I'm ready.